It has been a dramatic and violent week in Syria, and on Friday the fighting did ease, but many questions linger. The pause in the standoff between Kurdish forces and Turkey, which was brokered by Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, it remains fragile. There have been reports of gunfire. Still, President Erdogan of Turkey insists he is abiding by that agreement for now. President Trump says he takes Erdogan's word. Others, however, are on edge about Turkey's military push, including Kurdish allies who have accused Turkey of war crimes. The president's actions in Syria have also unleashed a firestorm of criticism from top Republicans.
Any commander-in-chief who gives territory back to the enemy that was seized by blood of our allies and our soldiers is doing a great disservice to the military. ISIS will most certainly reemerge.
Joining me to discuss these quickly unfolding events, Ashley Parker, White House reporter for The Washington Post, Susan Davis, congressional correspondent for NPR, Vivian Salama, White House reporter for The Wall Street Journal, and Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. Vivian, you've been covering foreign policy for years, now covering the White House. How are U.S. allies responding to this unfolding situation in Syria?
I mean, this is something that has implications for countries around the world, and so obviously a lot of concern growing, especially in Europe, Middle Eastern countries, because at the end of the day, a big part of the reason we were there to begin with was to contain ISIS, and essentially a number of people saying that this is what was so important. It was so important for us to stay in Syria because of U.S. national security. ISIS grows, it spreads, the potential for attack grows. And so European countries obviously very worried about that. They're worried about another flood of refugees across their borders, as well as a number of other issues. Obviously, Middle Eastern countries also afraid of spillover. And so this has repercussions that are being felt around the world.
And did President Erdogan play President Trump here? What's the view inside the White House about how the ceasefire came about and whether it will hold?
Well, we have that Zelensky transcript with the president. I think everyone would love to see the transcript of this call with Erdogan, but you can safely say that people inside his administration were shocked at the news. On the one hand, it wasn't that surprising because the president campaigned on it ending endless wars, withdrawing. He threatened to withdraw from Syria previously, but this is something that came so quickly that was not sort of well planned or well expected, and that goes against the recommendations and advice of a number of top people in his administration. And one thing that's reflective of that I think cannot be overstated enough is that we are finally seeing real criticism from Republicans on Capitol Hill. And Republicans never criticize this president ever. So to see so many people, including someone like Senator Lindsey Graham, a golf buddy, a close friend, coming out and saying on this policy, this was the wrong decision, this was unacceptable, just sort of underscores how much alarm there really is within the administration and the Republican Party.
Susan, you're on Capitol Hill for NPR. Is there alarm not only among Republicans, but among Democrats in the leadership in the House about the situation for the Kurds and their fate?
Yeah, I mean, there's alarm. I think lawmakers have been appalled by this. The president's really lonely here. He doesn't have the support even of some of his former administration officials who stepped down over this policy, people like former Defense Secretary James Mattis. I think, you know, Congress can't often agree that today's even Friday, let alone agree on a major policy like this. And you saw earlier this week that the House voted overwhelmingly on a symbolic resolution, but condemning essentially the president across the board for all of his actions and the implications here. This united, when you're uniting Liz Cheney, a Republican from Wyoming, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on a policy issue, you know you're in a pretty unusual place.
But let's get into why that is. And your point, Sue, about the president being alone. He sent an unusual letter to President Erdogan. He wrote, quote, "Let's work out a good deal. You don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people. And don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool. I will call you later." Erdogan reportedly found the letter insulting, and some Republicans and Democrats were confounded by it. Jeff, when you're at the White House, what motivated the president to do this, to send that letter? Are there any guardrails around him?
The answer to the second question is no. And as far as what motivated him, this is just pure Trump. It is I think some people, when they first read that letter, wondered if it was actually real because the language was so informal. And apparently President Erdogan has also said, this isn't a big priority right now, but there will be a response. to this letter at some point. But it was Trump being Trump, using language that he uses on a regular basis with somebody who he considers a friend, but also somebody who he was trying to challenge after all of the criticism that he himself faced for this decision.
So there's no one in the cabinet who's pushing back. Is the president alone? Based on your reporting?
I think the president is largely alone, yes. I mean, I think even someone like John Bolton, who has now obviously left the White House, was someone who was pushing back on things like this. He doesn't have that anymore. He doesn't have a John Kelly. He doesn't have a chief of staff who was trying to have any sort of a mitigating influence on the president. And you see that with Mick Mulvaney very clearly. He's somebody who wants to keep this job. He still has the acting title. He's not trying to control the president.
So the president is trying to negotiate on many fronts as the leader, as someone who's engaging on his own. But what are the shifting power dynamics, Vivian, in the Middle East? Are we seeing now Russia walk into a vacuum in Syria? What does it mean for Iran? How does the president, he may think he can deal with Erdogan, but what does it mean, regardless of his actions, for the region?
I mean, we've left a vacuum, and it's a little bit complicated for people who don't follow the Middle East on a daily basis, but essentially a lot of what happened just in the last 2 weeks in part reversed a lot of the progress that the Kurds and other Syrians have made in their civil war for the last 8 years, in terms of the Kurds running back to Assad to ally themselves with him. In the meantime, our departure gave an open door for the Russians to come in and basically fill that vacuum, where they decided, okay, well, if the U.S. is not going to be there, we'll provide our services. They helped Turkey, but they're also allied to Assad and with Iran. And so there's all these different players coming in, players that the United States typically would not want to see getting a stronger foothold in the Middle East. But within 2 weeks, we already saw such a drastic shift, and it's alarming to think of what would come.
Ashley, when you think about President Trump, he's writing these letters to Erdogan and he's directing his own foreign policy, but you still had Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo go over there to try to negotiate this ceasefire. Are they trying to clean up their own president's actions? What is their role based on your reporting?
Well, the president spun that ceasefire or pause, as he even put it in a tweet, as a victory. But what they were really doing was they were going over for, less than 48 hours, basically, and trying to undo the damage that was caused by the president's decision just 10 days earlier. So it requires a little bit of creative spin to claim that you helping to slightly undo a catastrophe that you caused is a win.
We heard from one of President Trump's staunchest allies on Friday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who penned a strongly worded op-ed in the Washington Post. He said that Mr. Trump's decision to pull out troops in northern Syria was a grave strategic mistake, and it's something that will leave the American people and homeland less safe and embolden our enemies. McConnell did not refer to the president by name.
Didn't have to.
He didn't have to.
Part of what was striking to that, and we've heard that from other Republicans, from McConnell, Michael McCall, former Homeland Security Chairman in the House, now in Foreign Affairs, directly saying that the president's actions are increasing the risk of a domestic terror attack. Wow, right? I mean, Mitch McConnell has also said, we don't know what it's going to look like yet, but it doesn't seem likely that the potential ceasefire is going to stop Congress from moving forward on sanctions legislation next week. Nancy Pelosi in the House has already said the House will take up a bill. McConnell's indicated he wants to do something too. If anything, what's been interesting is he's indicating he wants to go stronger and tougher. I mean, McConnell, for him, I think this is, for a lot of Republicans and Democrats, this is a personal policy issue that goes beyond party loyalty, Donald Trump's 95% approval rating among Republicans. This is bigger than all that, and the response that we're going to see and the details in the sanctions are going to be very interesting to watch.
What's also interesting about that, to me, is how the president, that's beginning to get to him. At the very beginning, I remember, I think I was in the Roosevelt room the first day or two after he made that decision, and we asked him for a reaction to the Republican criticism, and he was very tame for President Trump. He said, I understand their position, that's not my position, but I understand it. Increasingly, as this criticism has increased, his response to that has also become more belligerent.
The evangelical Christians who are part of his political base it's not just Mitt Romney, the Utah senator, it's some of his base supporters.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's no doubt one reason why it's going through his head is, hey, maybe this is a problem. because he needs those evangelicals to come out just like he needs the rest of his base to
Is the
come
White
out in
House reaching out to
2020.
those voters or those leaders at all?
That's a good question. I was curious about that too. With Vice President Pence this week traveling, he would probably be the point man for that, but I don't know.
What about Democrats? You saw in the Democratic debate this week, Representative Gabbard of Hawaii, she's talking about she's against regime change wars and non-interventionism. About your point, he's a non-interventionist. There's also that strand in the Democratic Party. Are they full-throated hawks now on Syria, or are they having their own discussions?
They're definitely having their own discussions, and it's so much so that it actually prompted Hillary Clinton to weigh in today, and she said that the Russians are actually watching and have their eye on one particular candidate, which she didn't name any names as well, but as you said, Tulsi Gabbard was really promoting this idea of, well, you know what, like we should leave them to their own vices, and maybe we should see how this plays out. The interesting thing, I just want to make one point to Jeff's point, is like a lot of these members on the Hill have learned from past experiences. They've learned from precedent. And, President Obama hastily withdrew from Iraq in 2011, and we ended up going back there 3 years later because of the fact that ISIS started to grow. Our absence was definitely something that created this whole problem where, the extremist elements were able to kind of fester around. And a lot of members on Capitol Hill remember that very, very well and keep on warning that we stay and this is going to get worse.
But one counterpoint, which Jeff is totally right that the president, that criticism is now getting to him. But one thing that's been interesting is he's had a couple of rallies where he's talked about this. And when he talks to his rallies, which again are his core base supporters, and he talks about endless wars and bringing troops home and not spending money overseas that should be being spent here, that's still a big applause line. He gets people chanting, bring them home, bring them home. And so the president, he cares about his base. He needs to care about evangelicals. He especially needs to care about Republicans on Capitol Hill as he's facing an impeachment. But for those core supporters who energize the president, they are 100% on board, at least with the Cliff's Notes pitch, which is we're ending endless wars and we're bringing our troops home.